Five cousins vanished from a Texas lodge in 1997. FBI's 2024 discovery shocked everyone. In the summer of 1997, the Ramirez family planned a reunion at a remote hunting lodge tucked deep in the Texas Hill Country. Five teenage cousins, Daniel, Sophia, Miguel, Elena, and Javier, were especially excited. They were inseparable, often calling themselves the Five Stars because they believed they were destined to shine together forever. On July 14th, the cousins went for an evening walk around the lodge grounds. They promised their parents they'd return before nightfall. But when the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness covered the canyon, the cousins never came back. At first, the family thought they had simply lost track of time. But when midnight passed, worry turned into panic. A search party began immediately. Local sheriffs, volunteers, and even dogs scoured the woods. No trace of the five cousins was found. No footprints, no clothing, not even a dropped flashlight. It was as though the earth had swallowed them whole. The FBI joined the investigation within days, labeling it one of the strangest mass disappearances in Texas history. Rumors spread quickly. Some whispered about wild animals, others about dangerous strangers hiding in the canyons. A few locals even spoke of old legends tied to the land, stories of spirits that claimed wandering children. But without evidence, the case went cold. For nearly 3 decades, the families carried the unbearable weight of unanswered questions. Every year, on the anniversary, relatives gathered at the abandoned lodge to light candles and pray. Hope never fully died, but closure seemed impossible. Then, in early 2024, everything changed. During a land survey for new construction near the old lodge, workers stumbled upon something shocking: a hidden underground cellar sealed with heavy wooden beams. Inside were rusted camping supplies, faded photographs, and chillingly, 5 sets of personal belongings belonging to the missing cousins. The FBI quickly took over. What they uncovered inside that cellar was darker than anyone could have imagined. Evidence pointed not to wild animals or legends, but to human hands. Someone had lured the cousins into that cellar in 1997 and ensured they would never leave. When the FBI revealed their findings, families were shattered all over again. But for the first time in 27 years, the truth had finally surfaced. The discovery shocked not only the families but the entire nation, reopening one of Texas's most haunting mysteries. The summer of 1997 in Texas was unusually warm, with days stretching into golden evenings and nights filled with the buzzing of cicadas. Families across the state planned outdoor gatherings, road trips, and celebrations under the open sky. For the Ramirez family, it was the perfect time to reunite at an old hunting lodge tucked deep into the rugged Texas Hill Country. The lodge wasn't fancy. Its wooden beams creaked with age, and its stone fireplace carried the scent of decades-old campfires. But it held history, and more importantly, it held memories. That year, nearly 30 members of the extended family gathered at the lodge. Grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins spilled out onto the porch, their laughter echoing through the quiet valley. The air was filled with the smells of barbecued meat, roasted corn, and the smoky sweetness of mesquite wood. It was the kind of reunion that reminded everyone why family mattered, even when life pulled them in different directions. Among all the relatives, 5 cousins stood out. They were inseparable. Daniel, the oldest at 17, a natural leader with a protective streak. Sophia, 16, curious and thoughtful, often carrying a journal with her. Miguel, 15, adventurous and always testing limits. Elena, 14, shy but deeply observant. And the youngest, Javier, only 13, full of restless energy. Together, they were known as the 5 Stars, a nickname their grandmother had given them when they were little, saying each of them shone in their own way. The cousins had been looking forward to the reunion for weeks. They had grown up together, playing in each other's backyards, celebrating holidays side by side, and even sharing childhood secrets that no one else knew. For them, this reunion wasn't just another family gathering. It was a chance to reconnect with their shared adventures and create new memories that would last long after summer ended. As the reunion began, the cousins spent the day exploring the lodge's surroundings. They walked along narrow dirt trails that twisted through oak trees, tossed stones into the nearby creek, and played old games their parents had once played in the same place. The adults watched with smiles, reminiscing about their own youth at the very same lodge decades earlier. It seemed as though the land carried echoes of laughter from generation to generation. By evening, as the family gathered around picnic tables under strings of lanterns, the energy was alive with stories. The uncles told tales of hunting trips in the canyon. The aunts shared recipes passed down through generations. Every so often, the cousins would glance at one another, grinning mischievously. They had already whispered among themselves about sneaking off for a little nighttime adventure, something thrilling to cap off the day. The lodge, though full of warmth, carried an undeniable sense of isolation. Surrounded by dense woods and rocky canyons, the nearest town was over 30 miles away. At night, the darkness was so complete that it swallowed the horizon, leaving only the stars above to break it. For the cousins, this remoteness wasn't frightening. It was exhilarating. It meant freedom, the chance to explore without limits, to write their own story in a place untouched by the noise of the outside world. The grandparents watched over the gathering from rocking chairs on the porch, their faces glowing in the lantern light. They were proud to see the younger generation so tightly knit, just as their own children had once been. The parents, busy with laughter and food, trusted their teenagers to enjoy themselves responsibly. No one could have guessed that this night, filled with warmth and togetherness, would soon be remembered not for joy, but for sorrow. Inside the lodge, an old radio played soft country tunes, its static mixing with the sound of cicadas outside. The cousins sat together near the fire pit, sharing plans for what they would do once the adults turned in. Daniel wanted to take them farther along the creek. Miguel suggested exploring the ridge beyond the lodge, and Sophia, always curious, wanted to look inside some of the old sheds nearby. They didn't realize that their innocent excitement would soon carry them down a path that no one could have predicted. As dusk deepened into night, the family reunion continued in cheerful tones. Glasses clinked, stories echoed, and fireflies danced in the warm air. But within the laughter and glowing lantern light, the five cousins were already preparing themselves for a small journey that would mark the last time their family ever saw them together. As twilight settled over the Texas lodge, the atmosphere shifted. The lanterns strung across the porch gave off a soft glow, but beyond their reach, the wilderness stretched into shadows. Crickets chirped, the air cooled, and the sky turned a deep shade of indigo. It was in this moment that the five cousins decided to slip away for their evening walk. To the adults, it was nothing unusual, just children stretching their legs before bed. But for the cousins, it felt like an adventure waiting to unfold. Daniel, the eldest, led the way. He always felt a responsibility to watch over the others, especially his younger brother Javier. With a flashlight in hand and a steady confidence, he reassured the group that he knew the trails well enough. Sophia followed close behind, holding her journal against her chest, as if she might record something memorable from the night. Miguel carried an old pocket knife he had borrowed from his uncle, pretending he was ready for any danger. Elena walked quietly, listening more than speaking, her eyes alert to every sound. Javier, restless and eager, darted ahead only to be pulled back by Daniel's firm grip. The trail they chose wound around the lodge's property and into the woods. The first stretch was familiar, marked by worn stones and tall grass, but within minutes, the lantern lights from the lodge disappeared behind them. The world grew darker, quieter, and the only sounds were the crunch of gravel under their shoes and the occasional rustle in the trees. For the cousins, the growing darkness wasn't frightening, it was thrilling. They whispered jokes, laughed nervously, and dared one another to keep walking further. As they moved deeper, the forest seemed to change. The air grew heavier, and the trees pressed closer together, their branches weaving a canopy that blocked the faint moonlight. The cousins noticed how different everything looked at night. The same creek they played in during the day now sounded louder and more restless, and the shadows of the rocks seemed to shift as if alive. Miguel, always the brave one, teased Elena for walking so carefully, but even he felt the weight of the night pressing in. Every so often, the cousins paused to listen. An owl hooted from somewhere high above, and something rustled in the brush nearby. Javier swore he saw movement, but Daniel brushed it off as a deer. Still, the silence that followed their laughter carried an edge. It was the kind of silence where every sound became amplified, every crack of a twig felt deliberate. Yet none of them suggested turning back. Not yet. They eventually came upon a clearing, one they hadn't noticed earlier in the day. The ground dipped slightly, and in the middle stood a weathered wooden post, half buried in the dirt as though it had once marked something important. The cousins circled it curiously, wondering if it was a remnant of an old ranch or part of the lodge's forgotten history. Sophia bent down to brush dirt from its surface, her fingers tracing faint, carved letters she couldn't quite read. Daniel urged her to leave it, insisting they'd have time to figure out later. From the clearing, two paths stretched in opposite directions. One led back toward the creek, familiar and safe. The other veered into thicker woods, darker and untraveled. Miguel pushed for the second path, his adventurous spirit refusing to settle for what they already knew. Daniel hesitated, torn between caution and the desire to keep the group's energy alive. In the end, curiosity won, and the cousins chose the darker path. None of them realized that this choice would forever change their story. As they walked further, their voices grew softer. Even Javier, who was usually the loudest, kept closer to his siblings. The flashlight's beam cut across roots and stones, catching glimpses of insects and the occasional reflective eyes of small creatures watching from the brush. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to carry an unspoken weight, as though the forest itself was aware of their presence. A faint wind stirred the branches above, and Sophia scribbled something quickly in her journal, whispering that the night felt different. Elena agreed quietly, sensing the same shift but unable to describe it. Daniel tried to maintain control, though his grip on the flashlight tightened with each passing step. They weren't lost yet, but the path no longer looked as clear, and the lodge felt impossibly far away. Still, the cousins pressed on, unaware that with every step they were crossing an invisible line, moving from the safety of their family reunion into the shadows of a mystery that would haunt Texas for decades. Their walk, meant to be a harmless adventure, was slowly becoming the beginning of something no one would ever forget. At tea first, when the cousins didn't return by sunset, the adults at the lodge weren't concerned. Teenagers were known for losing track of time, and the five had always been adventurous. Their parents assumed they were still laughing somewhere by the creek or sitting under the trees, sharing stories the way they always did. Dinner was served, lanterns glowed, and the air carried the smell of roasted food. But as plates began to empty and the evenings stretched into night, unease slowly crept into the family gathering. By 9 p.m., the grandparents, who had been rocking gently on the porch, asked where the children were. Their absence was beginning to feel noticeable. An uncle went out to the edge of the property and called their names, expecting the cousins to come running back at the sound of his voice. The only answer was the low chorus of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Still, no one panicked yet. It was assumed the cousins were close, just lingering a little longer in the night air. By 10 p.m., the mood had shifted, laughter had faded, and conversations had quieted. The parents exchanged glances, some irritated, others worried. One of the aunts wrapped a shawl tightly around herself, saying she didn't like how dark it had gotten in the woods. Daniel's mother called out again and again, her voice echoing into the distance, but there was no response. Miguel's father grabbed a flashlight and walked down the familiar trail, swearing he'd find them within minutes. He returned half an hour later, shaking his head, his expression tighter than before. By 11 p.m., unease had turned into something heavier. Several of the men grabbed lanterns and flashlights, determined to search the grounds. They fanned out along the lodge's trails, calling the children's names louder now. Some of the women stayed behind, pacing the porch, glancing at the clock, praying under their breath. The younger children clung to their mothers, sensing the growing tension in the air. The night no longer felt peaceful. It felt charged, as though the woods were holding a secret no one wanted to face. Just before midnight, one of the searchers thought he heard movement near the creek, a sound like branches breaking. The group rushed toward it, shining their lights across the water, but nothing was there. No voices, no footprints, only the restless sound of the stream. One of the uncles muttered that maybe the cousins had gone further than they should have, perhaps wandering to the ridge where the land dropped steeply. That thought made the group quicken their pace, fear creeping into their throats. Back at the lodge, the atmosphere had changed completely. The fire that had once brought warmth now flickered weakly, almost mocking in its glow. The grandparents sat stiffly, hands clasped in silent prayer. Sophia's mother began crying quietly, clutching her daughter's sweater that had been left on a chair earlier in the day. Every tick of the clock felt like a hammer, driving home the realization that something was wrong. No parent wanted to voice the thought, but lingered heavily in every heart. Children don't just disappear. Shortly after midnight, the family made a decision. This was no longer a case of kids coming back late from an adventure. Something was off, terribly off. One of the uncles drove to the nearest town, nearly 40 minutes away, to alert the local sheriff. In the meantime, the rest of the family kept searching, lanterns swaying in the dark, voices straining against the silence of the forest. Each call of the cousins' names seemed weaker than the last, swallowed by the heavy night. The woods themselves seemed to grow darker as the hours stretched on. Strange sounds echoed, snaps of branches, low whistles of wind, but nothing revealed the cousins' whereabouts. The adults began to argue in whispers. Some thought the kids had gotten lost, others feared an accident, while a few, with voices trembling, dared to suggest that maybe someone else had been out there with them. The suggestion hung in the air like smoke, but no one wanted to acknowledge it out loud. By 2 a.m., fatigue set in, but no one dared to stop searching. Flashlights were dimming, lantern oil was running low, and yet the family pressed on, stumbling through brush, scanning every corner of the woods. The lodge, once a place of joy and reunion, now felt like a prison of dread. The night that had begun with laughter was now heavy with fear, silence, and the unanswered question that burned in every mind. Where were the 5 cousins? Every second of that night etched itself into the memories of the Ramirez family. The helplessness of calling out into a void, the sting of branches against their skin as they searched, the bitter taste of fear in their throats. All of it would stay with them forever. The first night of panic had begun, and though no one knew it yet, it was only the start of a nightmare that would span decades. By dawn the next morning, the quiet hills around the Texas Lodge had transformed into a hive of activity. The Ramirez family, exhausted from a sleepless night of searching, watched as sheriff's deputies arrived in their patrol cars, headlights slicing through the misty morning air. Radios crackled, boots crunched across the gravel, and the once peaceful lodge grounds became the center of a frantic search effort. What began as a family's worst fear was now an official missing persons case. The sheriff wasted no time. He ordered deputies to spread out in teams, covering the creek, the ridges, and the thick woods surrounding the property. Bloodhounds were brought in, their noses pressed to sweaters and shoes belonging to the cousins. The dogs barked and strained at their leashes, leading handlers down paths and into the forest. Every family member clung to hope that the children would be found huddled together somewhere, lost but alive. Yet each minute that passed without a discovery weighed heavier on everyone's hearts. By midday, more volunteers had arrived from nearby towns. Farmers, hunters, and ranchers who knew the land joined the effort, bringing their own dogs, horses, and supplies. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades slicing the air as spotters peered down into the dense canopy. The scene looked less like a family reunion and more like a military operation. Still, the forest kept its secrets. No matter how many boots trampled its soil, It offered no clues about where the five cousins had gone. Searchers found themselves combing through every corner of the landscape. They waded into the creek, dragging nets through the water in case the children had slipped and fallen in. Others climbed the ridge, calling the cousins' names until their voices turned hoarse. A few even entered abandoned sheds and hunting cabins scattered across the hills, sweeping flashlights over dusty floors and cobwebbed corners. The silence that answered them in every location was deafening. By evening, the FBI had been notified. Disappearances involving 5 children at once were far too unusual to ignore. Federal agents arrived with more equipment: infrared scanners, advanced radios, and forensic kits. They worked alongside local deputies, interviewing family members one by one. Every detail mattered: what time the cousins left, what they were wearing, what they had been talking about. But no answer pointed clearly to where they had gone. It was as though the woods had swallowed them whole. The search area expanded quickly. Law enforcement set up checkpoints along country roads, stopping cars to ask if drivers had seen 5 teenagers walking or hitchhiking. Flyers with the cousins' photos were printed and taped to telephone poles and shop windows in nearby towns. Helicopters flew into the night, their searchlights sweeping across the treetops like giant fingers probing the darkness. The more resources poured into the search, the stranger it seemed that nothing, absolutely nothing, was found. By the second day, tension ran high. Volunteers whispered among themselves, trading theories. Some believed the cousins had gotten lost and would eventually stumble back, hungry and shaken but alive. Others feared a wild animal attack, though no signs of blood or torn clothing were ever discovered. And then there were darker suggestions that someone had lured the children away, hiding them where no one thought to look. Those words spread like wildfire, but no one dared say them aloud in front of the grieving parents. The FBI agents worked tirelessly, combing through the lodge itself for anything unusual. They checked the cellars, the attic, and even the old fire pit where the family had gathered. Agents dusted surfaces for fingerprints, though the lodge was too full of family touches to be of use. What they were searching for was a single overlooked detail, a clue that might unravel the mystery of 5 cousins vanishing in plain sight. But every lead evaporated as quickly as it appeared. Days blurred together as the search stretched on. Hundreds of people had now combed the surrounding hills, yet the landscape yielded no answers. The parents began to crumble under the weight of uncertainty. Some collapsed in exhaustion, while others refused to rest, insisting on searching until their legs gave out. The grandparents sat silently on the porch, their eyes fixed on the tree line, as if waiting for the cousins to walk back at any moment. Hope flickered, but doubt grew stronger with each setting sun. Despite the enormous scale of the operation, the forest remained defiant. No torn fabric, no dropped flashlight, not even a footprint could be linked to the missing cousins. Every piece of evidence seemed to vanish before it could be found. The search that had begun with confidence and determination was now turning into a mystery that left even seasoned law enforcement officers baffled. And still, the question loomed over everyone like a storm cloud. How could 5 children disappear without leaving a single trace? As the days passed without any sign of the 5 cousins, the silence surrounding their disappearance began to fill with whispers. At first, the rumors were quiet. Hushed conversations exchanged among neighbors, murmurs at grocery stores, and speculation shared at church gatherings. But soon, those whispers grew louder, spreading across the county and weaving themselves into every conversation. People were desperate for answers, and in the absence of facts, stories took their place. Some of the earliest rumors suggested that the cousins had simply run away. Teenagers, after all, were known to test boundaries, and 5 together might have planned an escape. But those who knew the cousins best rejected this idea immediately. None of them had packed bags, taken money, or shown signs of planning such a move. Besides, why would all 5 disappear together without leaving so much as a note? Still, the rumor lingered, feeding into gossip circles. Others pointed to the wilderness itself. Texas Hill Country was known for its rugged terrain, and many speculated that the children had wandered too far into the woods. Tales of wild animals, mountain lions, coyotes, even snakes, spread quickly. Neighbors recalled hearing strange cries in the night, swearing they might have been more than just owls. Yet law enforcement found no tracks, no blood, and no evidence of an animal attack. The absence of proof only deepened the mystery. Then there were the darker whispers. Some locals claimed to have seen suspicious vehicles near the lodge on the night the cousins vanished. A pickup truck with no license plate was said to have driven slowly down the dirt road, its headlights dimmed. Another neighbor insisted they heard shouting carried by the wind around midnight. None of these reports were ever confirmed, but they fueled the growing theory that the cousins hadn't simply gotten lost. They had been taken. Superstition also found its way into the conversations. The lodge was old, built on land with a history that stretched back generations. Locals spoke of ghost stories tied to the hills, legends of spirits who lured travelers into the woods, never to return. Children in nearby towns whispered that the land was cursed, that anyone who stayed there too long would be claimed by it. To the grieving Ramirez family, such talk felt cruel, but the rumors refused to die. The FBI tried to suppress wild speculation, urging people to focus on facts. Press conferences were held, updates were given, and officials reassured the public that every lead was being followed. But outside the official reports, people preferred their own theories. Coffee shops buzzed with debates, and late-night radio shows turned the case into a topic of national curiosity. The disappearance of 5 cousins wasn't just a tragedy anymore. It was becoming a legend in its own right. Even within the family, whispers grew. Some relatives questioned whether all 5 had decided to sneak away and gotten caught in something darker than they intended. Others wondered if someone close to the family might know more than they were admitting. The parents tried to shut down such talk, insisting on unity, but in private moments, suspicion flickered in their eyes. Grief and desperation made everyone vulnerable to doubt. At the lodge, the atmosphere became heavy with rumors carried in by visitors. Journalists, thrill seekers, and self-proclaimed psychics began arriving, offering theories, visions, and stories of their own. Some claimed they felt presences in the woods. Others declared they had dreams pointing to where the children might be found. The family, torn between hope and frustration, listened to anyone who might provide a clue, no matter how far-fetched. The community itself began to fracture. Some residents accused outsiders of bringing trouble into their town, while others believed the mystery had roots closer to home. Law enforcement received dozens of tips, each more bizarre than the last. Strangers lurking in shadows, unexplained lights in the hills, and secret tunnels beneath the lodge. The truth was buried beneath a mountain of speculation, making it harder for investigators to know which lead, if any, could be trusted. By the end of the first week, the whispers had become a storm. They carried through homes, schools, and workplaces, each retelling of the story adding new details that may or may not have been real. The Ramirez cousins had become more than missing children. They had become the center of a chilling puzzle, one that people feared, obsessed over, and mythologized. And in that growing fog of rumor, the line between fact and fiction blurred beyond recognition. Weeks turned into months, and despite every effort, the investigation began to lose momentum. At first, the case had dominated local headlines and evening news broadcasts. Every update from the FBI was treated as breaking news, and every new search effort brought hope. But as time dragged on with no answers, coverage grew less frequent, and the sense of urgency began to fade. What was once an active hunt was slowly becoming a painful waiting game. The FBI and local authorities had exhausted nearly every resource. They had combed through miles of rugged terrain, conducted countless interviews, and followed hundreds of leads, yet none had led them closer to the missing cousins. Search dogs could no longer pick up scents after so much time had passed. Helicopters stopped circling the skies above the Texas hill country. The once busy command post near the lodge now stood quiet, its maps and pin boards gathering dust. Inside the community, frustration began to replace fear. Some people blamed the authorities, claiming they hadn't acted fast enough. Others whispered that the family knew more than they were admitting. The Ramirez family found themselves caught in a cruel spotlight. Grieving parents forced to defend themselves against cruel speculation while still hoping for answers. Their lives had become frozen in that summer of 1997, while the rest of the world moved forward. By the first anniversary of the disappearance, the case had officially been labeled inactive. That didn't mean it was closed. The FBI kept files on the incident, but active searches had stopped. The word cold case was whispered with dread. For the family, it was like a death sentence without a body. They had no graves to visit, no certainty of what had happened, only an endless limbo of not knowing. The lodge itself became a haunting symbol. Once a place of laughter, family, and tradition, it now stood as a reminder of what had been lost. The Ramirez family stopped visiting, unable to bear the memories that lingered in its walls. The wooden beams creaked louder in the silence, and the once bright fireplace sat cold and unused. Locals driving past the area often remarked how the lodge looked abandoned, almost swallowed by the wilderness itself. In the absence of answers, myths began to grow stronger. The case slipped from headlines, but lived on in hushed stories told around campfires and whispered warnings to children. Teenagers dared one another to walk near the lodge at night, convinced the cousins' spirits lingered there. Folklore began to weave itself into the reality of the tragedy, turning it into something larger than life, a mystery that hovered between fact and legend. The parents, though devastated, refused to let their children's memory fade. They appeared at community events, gave interviews when asked, and worked tirelessly to keep the case alive in the public's mind. Each year on the anniversary, they gathered at the lodge, lighting candles and placing photos of the 5 cousins on the porch. But with each passing year, fewer reporters showed up and fewer neighbors joined them. What had once united the community now seemed like a fading echo. Law enforcement occasionally revisited the case when new tips came in, but they always ended the same way: dead ends, false leads, or hoaxes. People claimed to have seen the cousins in other states, wandering towns, or even traveling with strangers. Some tips suggested they had been taken across the border. Each report sparked brief hope, only to crash into disappointment. The cycle of rising and falling hope became a cruel rhythm for the Ramirez family. The FBI agents who had once filled the lodge grounds eventually moved on to other cases. Files were stacked away in cabinets, marked and categorized, but rarely revisited. For the Ramirez family, the silence from investigators was the hardest part. No calls, no updates, no new theories, just silence. The world had moved on, but their world remained trapped in July 1997. And so, the case slipped into the long shadow of time, joining the ranks of unsolved disappearances that haunt history. The photographs of the 5 smiling cousins still hung on the walls of their homes, their eyes frozen in youth, untouched by the years passing outside. The unanswered questions gnawed at everyone who had ever loved them. How could 5 children vanish without a trace, and how could so much effort still leave nothing behind? The disappearance of the 5 cousins carved a permanent scar into the Ramirez family. In the beginning, the parents clung to each other, united by their grief and desperation. They formed a tight circle, attending every press conference together, searching the woods side by side, and praying in the same church pews. But as months turned into years with no answers, that unity began to strain under the weight of silence. Grief has many faces, and each parent carried it differently, sometimes in ways that clashed with the others. Some parents turned inward, retreating into silence and refusing to speak about their missing children at all. Others became more vocal, demanding answers from law enforcement and pushing for the case to stay open. At family gatherings, conversations that once flowed with laughter now often ended in arguments about what more could be done, about whether hope was realistic, about whether the truth would ever be found. The tragedy had tied them together, but it also pulled them apart. For the younger siblings of the missing cousins, childhood was never the same. They grew up in the shadow of a mystery they could not understand, always reminded of the brothers and sisters who never came home. Schoolmates whispered about the case. Teachers looked at them with pity, and friends often didn't know what to say. Birthdays and holidays became painful reminders that someone was missing from the table, and photographs always felt incomplete. Grandparents carried the heaviest burden of all. They had lived long enough to see generations of their family grow, but the loss of 5 grandchildren in one night was a wound they could never heal from. They kept the cousins' belongings close: Daniel's baseball cap, Sophia's journal, Miguel's pocket knife, Elena's favorite book, Javier's worn sneakers, as if holding on to those items might somehow bring them back. Each object was both a comfort and a reminder of the void left behind. The impact stretched beyond the Ramirez family itself. Cousins, aunts, and uncles who lived in other states found themselves haunted by guilt for not being there, for not somehow preventing the tragedy. Some stopped visiting Texas altogether, unable to face the lodge where it had all happened. Family reunions grew smaller, quieter, and eventually ceased altogether. What had once been a tradition of joy was now a reminder of loss, a tradition broken in the cruelest way. Daily life for the parents became a balancing act between normalcy and despair. They still had jobs, bills, and responsibilities, but everything was colored by the absence of their children. Some poured themselves into work as a distraction, while others quit their jobs entirely, unable to function in the world outside their grief. For them, time stood still on that summer night in 1997, while the rest of the world marched forward without them. The psychological toll was relentless. Nightmares haunted their sleep, and even in waking hours, they sometimes thought they heard their children's voices in the distance. Simple sounds, a knock on the door, the ring of a phone, would send jolts of hope through them, only to crash into disappointment when it was nothing. Hope became both their greatest strength and their greatest torment, keeping them alive, but also trapping them in endless cycles of expectation and heartbreak. Faith was both a refuge and a battlefield. Some parents leaned heavily on prayer, believing that only God knew the truth and would someday reveal it. Others struggled with anger toward their faith, asking how such a tragedy could be allowed to happen. At memorial services, voices cracked under the weight of unspoken questions, and hymns often ended in tears rather than comfort. Their faith, once a steady foundation, now felt like fragile glass threatening to shatter. Even the homes of the families changed. Bedrooms were left untouched, frozen in time with posters on the walls and toys on the shelves. Dust gathered, but nothing was moved, as if the cousins might walk through the door at any moment and need their rooms just the way they left them. Visitors often said stepping into those rooms felt like stepping back into 1997, an eerie preservation of lives that should have grown but never did. As years stretched into decades, the weight of not knowing grew heavier. The families learned to live with the pain, but it never dulled. It simply became part of who they were. Their lives were defined not just by who was present, but by who was missing. And though the world outside largely forgot, the Ramirez family carried the absence of Daniel, Sophia, Miguel, Elena, and Javier with them every single day, as if time itself had never truly moved forward. The silence that followed the disappearance of the 5 cousins was more haunting than any sound. In the first days after the tragedy, the Ramirez Lodge was alive with commotion. Police radios crackled, dogs barked as they picked up scents, helicopters thudded in the sky, and reporters shouted questions at desperate parents. But when the search teams packed up and the news vans rolled away, an eerie quietness settled over the area. That silence was more terrifying than the chaos because it felt like the land itself had swallowed the children whole. Neighbors who lived near the lodge said they never forgot those nights. At first, the forest was filled with shouting, flashlights, and the sound of boots crunching over leaves. But when search efforts slowed, the woods returned to stillness, a stillness so heavy that it made people uneasy to walk past. Some locals claimed that the silence wasn't natural, that the usual sounds of crickets, owls, and coyotes seemed to vanish in that part of the canyon, replaced by a suffocating quiet that pressed down on anyone who lingered. For the families, the silence was its own form of torture. They had expected answers, some kind of noise in the form of a phone call, a discovery, or even a rumor that might point them toward the truth. But instead, days turned into weeks with nothing but the hollow echo of their own unanswered questions. Every knock at the door that didn't come, every call that never rang, deepened the silence until it became unbearable. The media played its role in amplifying that quiet. For a brief period, the story was everywhere. Front-page headlines, television specials, and nightly updates. Then, just as quickly, coverage dwindled. New tragedies replaced old ones, and the five cousins were pushed into the background of public memory. For the Ramirez family, the sudden media silence felt like betrayal. They had begged the world to keep watching, to keep listening, but the cameras stopped rolling, leaving them to face the void alone. Law enforcement, too, fell quiet. After months of fruitless searching, the FBI closed their command post at the lodge. Detectives still followed up on occasional tips, but those updates came less and less frequently. Parents who had once received daily calls now heard nothing for months at a time. The silence from investigators was perhaps the most unbearable of all, because it left them wondering if anyone was still looking, or if their children's story had already been abandoned. The silence stretched beyond official channels and into personal lives. Friends and neighbors who once offered support grew quieter as the years passed. Some avoided the topic altogether, afraid of reopening old wounds. Others simply moved on, their lives full of new concerns, while the Ramirez family remained frozen in the same nightmare. This social silence made the parents feel as though even their grief was invisible, as if no one wanted to acknowledge the tragedy anymore. That emptiness echoed especially loudly at the lodge itself. Each year, some family members would return to stand in the very place where their children had last been seen. The wind rustled through the trees, but no voices called back. The dock where the cousins once played remained still, its wooden boards groaning only when stepped on. The silence there wasn't just an absence of sound. It was a reminder of the laughter and chatter that should have filled the air, but never would again. Psychologists who later studied the case noted that silence can be one of the most destructive forces in grief. It doesn't just leave questions unanswered, it magnifies them. Without new information, the mind begins to invent possibilities, spinning endless scenarios in an attempt to fill the void. For the Ramirez family, the silence became fertile ground for theories, suspicions, and dark imaginings that consumed them late at night. Rumors occasionally surfaced in town, whispers of strange vehicles seen near the lodge, or ghostly figures spotted in the woods, but they were never confirmed, never substantiated. Each rumor sparked a brief flicker of noise, only to collapse back into the crushing quiet. This cycle of hope and silence became a cruel rhythm, trapping the families in constant anticipation that always ended in nothing. Even decades later, long after 1997, the silence persisted. It followed the family into their homes, seeped into their conversations, and settled into the cracks of their daily lives. In many ways, the quiet absence of truth was more suffocating than if they had been given terrible news. The silence was not an ending. It was an endless loop, a reminder that the story of the five cousins had been frozen in time, locked in a void where no answers existed. Only questions that echoed in emptiness. In 2024, nearly 3 decades after the cousins vanished, the case that had long been considered cold was suddenly pulled back into the spotlight. Families who had endured 27 years of silence were startled when they received a call from the FBI. The agency announced that the case of the 5 missing cousins from the Texas Lodge was officially being reopened. For some, the news felt like a long overdue acknowledgement of their pain. For others, it stirred up old wounds they had struggled for years to suppress. The FBI rarely reopens cases of this age without compelling reason. What triggered their renewed interest remained vague at first, cloaked in secrecy. Officials hinted at new information and modern forensic opportunities, but refused to elaborate. This careful choice of words sparked speculation among the families, the media, and the public at large. Was there finally a witness ready to talk after all these years? Had new technology uncovered traces of evidence overlooked back in 1997? Or was it something more chilling, something that connected this disappearance to other cases across the country? The families gathered once more at the Ramirez Lodge, where the FBI had set up a temporary command post. Seeing agents and investigators swarm the property again, almost exactly as they had nearly 3 decades ago, was surreal. For the parents, now much older, it was like being transported back to the worst days of their lives. The sight of yellow tape fluttering in the wind, the sound of boots moving over the soil, and the flash of camera equipment reminded them of the search that had ended with nothing but silence. This time, however, the atmosphere carried a different weight, an urgency, as if the agents already knew something that the families did not. As the investigation reopened, the FBI made it clear they would be applying methods unavailable in 1997. Soil samples from the lodge grounds, clothing fragments stored for decades, and even recorded interviews from that time were all subjected to modern forensic analysis. DNA testing, ground-penetrating radar, and digital facial aging technology were now at their disposal. The implication was clear. Even the smallest overlooked clue from the past might now unlock answers. For the families, this announcement sparked both hope and dread. What if those answers were too painful to bear? The reopening of the case also reignited the public's fascination. News outlets that had long forgotten the story scrambled to cover it once again. Documentaries, podcasts, and online forums dissected every shred of available information. Old neighbors were interviewed, reporters tracked down classmates of the cousins, and people who once thought the story was just a tragic memory suddenly found themselves at the center of a revived national mystery. The lodge, once abandoned and quiet, became a magnet for curiosity seekers, amateur sleuths, and conspiracy theorists. Within days of the reopening, whispers began to spread about why the FBI had chosen this particular moment to return. Some sources suggested that a hidden witness had finally come forward, breaking decades of silence. Others believed a deathbed confession had been made, possibly linking a known criminal to the cousin's disappearance. More unsettling theories suggested the FBI had uncovered a connection to human trafficking rings operating in the late 1990s. None of these possibilities were confirmed, but the very act of reopening the case made it clear that something significant had shifted. The families, torn between anticipation and fear, struggled to balance their emotions. For years, they had been forced to live in the void of not knowing. Now, the possibility of answers loomed close, but those answers might confirm their worst nightmares. Some parents prayed for closure, no matter how grim. Others admitted privately that they were terrified to learn what had really happened. After nearly 30 years of imagining endless scenarios, the truth, whatever it was, might finally strip away the fragile hope they had clung to. Investigators also revisited old suspects, knocking on doors that had not been touched since the late 90s. Former lodge employees, guests who had stayed there that summer, and locals who had been seen near the woods were all re-interviewed. Many were now elderly, their memories foggy, but the FBI pressed forward, believing that even a fractured recollection might hold weight when combined with new evidence. The idea that someone might have lived freely for almost 3 decades while holding the key to the cousin's fate cast a chilling shadow over the reopening. Even the land itself became a suspect again. Agents returned to the lodge grounds with high-tech equipment, scanning beneath the soil, probing the lakebed with sonar, and marking areas with flags and stakes. Locals gathered at the perimeter, watching quietly as if expecting the earth to finally give up its secrets. Some said the land had always carried a curse, and that the reopening was less about solving a crime than about confronting something dark that had never truly left the canyon. As the investigation deepened, the question everyone whispered but no one could answer grew louder. What had the FBI really found to make them return after so many years? That unanswered question hovered like a storm cloud over the families, the investigators, and the town itself, building a tension that hinted the silence of the past was about to be broken. But by what? No one could yet say. When the FBI announced that evidence had been unearthed at the Ramirez Lodge, the news spread like wildfire. For nearly 3 decades, investigators had scoured every inch of the lodge and its surrounding canyon, finding nothing conclusive. Yet now, in 2024, the ground itself seemed to yield secrets it had held tightly since that dreadful night in 1997. Locals gathered at the barricades, journalists camped outside the perimeter, and the families waited in an unbearable mix of hope and dread. The discovery began with a ground-penetrating radar scanned beneath the old storage shed at the far edge of the lodge property. This was a location dismissed in the original search, considered too insignificant to warrant more than a passing glance. But the radar showed unusual disturbances in the soil, patterns consistent with objects buried long ago. Investigators marked the spot, and with meticulous care, began digging. Within hours, they hit something solid. The air grew heavy with anticipation. What they uncovered first was not human remains, but personal belongings. Tattered scraps of clothing, a broken wristwatch, and what appeared to be a child's shoe were pulled from the dirt. Though deteriorated with age, these items were unmistakably from the 1990s. Each artifact was carefully sealed in evidence bags, photographed, and cataloged. To the families watching from a distance, the sight was devastating. The items looked eerily familiar, almost as if they belonged to their lost children. As the excavation continued, investigators found more disturbing evidence. A set of rusted handcuffs, partially buried and corroded, surfaced from the soil, closed by lay fragments of rope, frayed and rotted, suggesting restraint. These objects cast a chilling new light on the case, shifting the narrative from a simple disappearance to something far darker. Speculation swirled. Had the cousins been taken, restrained, and hidden here all along? Or were these items planted to mislead investigators even decades later? But the most haunting discovery came when the FBI uncovered a box, wrapped in deteriorating plastic and buried deeper beneath the shed. Inside, they found letters, fragments of notes written in trembling handwriting. Some were smudged beyond recognition, but a few words were still legible. Help, trapped, and don't forget us. Forensic teams immediately began working to authenticate the papers, but the emotional impact was immediate. To the families, the letters seemed like cries from the past, frozen in time and hidden where no one could find them. The lodge, once just a relic of tragedy, now became a crime scene alive with possibilities. Forensic tents sprouted like mushrooms. Lights illuminated the grounds through the night, and FBI agents moved with quiet urgency. Each new artifact pulled from the soil only deepened the mystery. How had all of this been overlooked before? Had someone deliberately concealed the evidence after the initial search, perhaps returning to the site when the investigation went cold? Media outlets reported the findings with sensational headlines. News anchors spoke of buried secrets and hidden messages from the missing. Online forums buzzed with theories. Some believed the cousins had been held captive at the lodge. Others speculated about ritualistic undertones, pointing to the eerie symbolism of items found near the belongings. Conspiracy theorists claimed the lodge had been part of a larger operation, one the authorities had intentionally kept quiet until now. The discovery also raised unsettling questions about those who once worked at the lodge. Former employees, now in their 60s and 70s, were suddenly thrust back under scrutiny. Did they know about the shed? Did they hear anything unusual in the weeks after the cousins disappeared? Some locals whispered about strange noises that had once come from that corner of the property, while others recalled seeing unfamiliar trucks near the lodge around that same time. None of these recollections were ever taken seriously back then, but now, every fragment mattered. The unearthed items were quickly transported to a secure FBI lab, where specialists worked tirelessly to preserve and analyze them. DNA testing, once impossible in the 1990s, now offered the potential to identify traces of the cousins, or even their captors, on the objects. The shoe, the wristwatch, the letters, each held the possibility of unlocking secrets that had been buried for nearly 30 years. To the families, the waiting was unbearable. They were told results could take weeks, but the mere knowledge that something tangible had finally been found kept them awake at night. Yet, even as evidence surfaced, shadows of doubt remained. Some wondered if the discoveries were only fragments of a much larger truth, clues that hinted at horrors still buried deeper, both literally and figuratively. The lodge had finally given up part of its secret, but what if the most important answers still lay hidden in the silent earth beneath it? When the FBI revealed what had been discovered beneath the old lodge shed, the families of the missing cousins were summoned to a secure briefing room. They had been through countless false alarms before, rumors of sightings, tips that went nowhere, even prank calls that twisted the knife deeper into their grief. Yet this time felt different. The weight in the investigators' voices and the guarded expressions on their faces told the families that something very real had been uncovered. The parents, now visibly older and worn by decades of pain, sat silently, clutching one another's hands as they braced for what was to come. As photographs of the items, clothing scraps, the shoe, the letters were displayed on the screen, gasps filled the room. One mother cried out instantly, recognizing the shoe as the same pair she had bought her son for his 13th birthday just weeks before the disappearance. Another family member covered their face in their hands, unable to look at the torn fabric that resembled a shirt their daughter had worn on that final summer night. The room was thick with grief, but also something else, an agonizing flood of memories that had lain dormant, now awakened with brutal clarity. The letters struck the hardest blow. Though many were smeared and faded, the faintly legible words "help" and "trapped" pierced through the hearts of the parents like knives. It was one thing to wonder about what had happened, but another to see desperate messages, possibly written by their children, buried under the earth for decades. Some parents sobbed uncontrollably, while others sat frozen, their grief manifesting as silent, hollow stares. The anguish was unbearable, but woven into it was a rising tide of anger. Who had hidden these letters, and why had they not been found sooner? In the days that followed, the families found themselves pulled into the relentless media storm. News vans lined their neighborhoods. Microphones were thrust in their faces, and every expression of grief was broadcast for the world to see. Some families welcomed the coverage, believing the attention might finally pressure authorities to deliver answers. Others resented it, feeling as though their private suffering was being turned into spectacle. Yet, no matter their views, none could escape the haunting reality that evidence of their children's final moments was now laid bare. The emotional toll began to fracture relationships within the families themselves. Some parents accused law enforcement of incompetence, convinced that had the shed been properly searched in 1997, their children might have been found alive. Others turned their blame inward, torturing themselves with what-ifs. What if they had been stricter? What if they hadn't let the cousins go to the lodge that summer? What if they had noticed something suspicious sooner? The burden of guilt, real or imagined, was merciless, gnawing at them with every passing day. For some, hope became more dangerous than despair. The discovery of belongings and letters suggested that the cousins had indeed been alive for some time after their disappearance. That possibility was devastating. Had they suffered? Were they calling for help while the world failed to hear them? The parents replayed these questions in their minds endlessly, unable to silence the horrific images that formed in their imaginations. Hope no longer brought comfort. It tore open wounds that had barely begun to scar. The younger siblings of the missing cousins, now adults themselves, were also forced to relive the nightmare. As children, they had grown up in the shadow of the tragedy, their identities forever tied to the vanished five. Now, seeing physical remnants of their brothers and sisters reignited trauma they had tried desperately to bury. Some broke down publicly in front of cameras, while others withdrew entirely, refusing to engage with the investigation. Each reacted differently, yet all shared the same burden. living with the ghostly presence of siblings who had never come home. Therapists and grief counselors were brought in, but even they struggled to ease the family's torment. The resurfacing of evidence did not bring closure. It reopened wounds that had festered for decades. Each family described the feeling as being forced to grieve all over again, only this time with even more haunting images attached. Sleepless nights returned, nightmares became routine, and the families found themselves caught in a cycle of reliving 1997 over and over, as though time had collapsed upon itself. Anger soon became as dominant as grief. Some families demanded immediate arrests, certain that someone still alive knew the truth. Others grew frustrated with the FBI's careful silence, convinced that critical details were being withheld. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed a lodge employee was involved, while others pointed to outsiders who had briefly worked in the area during that summer. But without answers, the families were left clinging to speculation, their frustration growing by the day. And yet, beneath all the grief, guilt, and anger, there lingered a chilling uncertainty. The families could not escape the gnawing fear that the evidence might only hint at a story far darker than they dared imagine. Were the cousins buried beneath that shed? Had someone deliberately hidden the traces, ensuring the truth would remain hidden for decades? Or was there still more waiting to be uncovered? Evidence that could completely rewrite what everyone thought they knew about that night at the lodge. The discovery beneath the shed ignited a fire within the FBI unlike anything seen in the case before. For 27 years, the disappearance of the 5 cousins had remained a haunting cold case, filed away in dusty cabinets and only revisited when anniversaries or documentaries stirred public interest. But now, with physical evidence in hand, the Bureau had no choice but to reopen the case. A new task force was assembled, made up of seasoned investigators, forensic experts, and criminal profilers who specialized in long unsolved disappearances. Their mission was simple yet daunting: follow the new evidence, wherever it might lead. The first shocking lead came from the analysis of the letters. Handwriting experts compared the faint words against samples provided by the families, school records, and even old diaries. The results suggested with chilling certainty that at least 2 of the letters had been written by the cousins themselves. More disturbing still was the realization that they had not been written all at once, but over time. Forensic ink analysis revealed different stages of aging in the writing, suggesting the cousins were alive for days, perhaps weeks, after they were last seen at the lodge. This revelation sent waves of horror through both investigators and families alike. Investigators then turned their attention to the lodge itself, which had long since closed down and been abandoned. The once bustling retreat was now nothing more than a decaying skeleton of its former self, its wooden walls warped with rot, its windows shattered, its halls echoing with silence. With search warrants in hand, the FBI combed through every inch of the property. Cadaver dogs sniffed the grounds, drones scanned the nearby forest, and ground-penetrating radar was used to detect disturbances beneath the soil. Within days, the team identified multiple anomalies buried around the property, sparking speculation about what might still lie hidden beneath the earth. A particularly disturbing discovery was made in the basement of the lodge. Behind a false wall, agents found a narrow space that resembled a crude holding area. Though it was empty, the marks on the walls, scratches and carvings, hinted at desperate attempts to escape. Faint initials matching some of the cousins' names were etched into the wood, along with tally marks that seemed to count the passing of days. The implications were horrifying. The cousins may have been kept captive, mere feet away from where investigators had searched back in 1997. Attention soon shifted to the original staff and owners of the lodge. Old employment records were pulled, and interviews were reconducted with everyone who had worked there during the summer of 1997. Some had died, some had disappeared, and others claimed to remember nothing unusual. Yet, inconsistencies began to emerge. One former handyman, who had left town abruptly after the cousins vanished, had never been fully cleared of suspicion. Now, with new evidence, his name resurfaced as a possible key to unraveling the mystery. The FBI also began re-examining tips that had been dismissed in the late 1990s. Among them was a report from a camper who claimed to have seen lights near the lodge shed long after midnight on the night the cousins disappeared. At the time, it had been brushed off as irrelevant. Now, investigators wondered if those lights had been tied to the concealment of the very evidence found decades later. What had once seemed like random noise in a flood of false leads was now being reinterpreted as potential truth. Modern forensic technology also breathed new life into old evidence. Soil samples taken from the shed revealed traces of human blood, long degraded but still identifiable through advanced DNA testing. Early results suggested a match with at least one of the cousins' families. This single detail transformed the investigation from one of speculation into undeniable fact. The cousins had been there. But whether they had died there or been taken elsewhere afterward remained a terrifyingly open question. The case also drew in criminal profilers, who began constructing psychological models of who could have orchestrated such a disappearance. Their analysis suggested a perpetrator with intimate knowledge of the lodge grounds, someone capable of moving unnoticed in the remote Texas wilderness, and someone who might have had access to the shed and basement without arousing suspicion. This profile pointed investigators back toward individuals tied directly to the lodge's operations. Yet it also opened the door to the chilling possibility of an outsider who had studied the area for years before striking. With every new discovery came renewed media frenzy. Reporters camped outside FBI field offices, desperate for updates, while documentaries rushed to piece together the story. Public pressure mounted, with the families demanding swift answers and the nation watching closely. Yet, despite the shocking leads, investigators remained cautious. They knew the evidence was fragmented, incomplete, and disturbingly suggestive of a far darker reality still buried in the shadows of 1997. The investigation pressed on with an unsettling urgency, each new revelation pulling agents deeper into a labyrinth of secrets surrounding the lodge. Yet with every piece of the puzzle that surfaced, more questions emerged. Who had built the false wall? Who buried the letters and belongings beneath the shed? And most haunting of all, why, after all these years, was the land itself finally giving up its secrets? As the FBI pushed deeper into the reopened investigation, the small Texas town surrounding the old lodge became the subject of intense scrutiny. On the surface, it was just another quiet, rural community where neighbors exchanged pleasantries and the biggest event of the year was the county fair. But beneath the charm and silence, agents quickly learned there was a long history of whispered rumors, unspoken fears, and tightly held secrets that had gone largely unnoticed for decades. The townspeople seemed hesitant, almost fearful, whenever the missing cousins were mentioned. It was as though the tragedy had become a shadow hanging over every household, something everyone knew but no one dared to fully acknowledge. Some residents revealed that in 1997, the night the cousins vanished, strange events had been noticed but never reported. One woman recalled seeing several cars parked near the lodge long after midnight, vehicles that didn't belong to any staff or visitors. Another remembered hearing screams in the distance, though at the time, she dismissed them as the wild sounds of the forest. The FBI began connecting these pieces, realizing that many locals might have been too afraid to come forward back then, fearing retaliation or ridicule. Now, decades later, the weight of silence was breaking, but only in whispers. There were also strange stories tied to the lodge itself. Some townsfolk claimed it had always carried a dark reputation, even before 1997. They spoke of disappearances dating back to the 1960s, unsolved robberies, and even rumors of occult gatherings in the surrounding woods. While much of this seemed like folklore, the consistency of the stories suggested that the lodge had long been a place of unease. For the FBI, the possibility that the cousins' case was not an isolated incident, but part of a deeper pattern was a chilling thought. Adding to the unease were whispers about the original owners of the lodge. The family who had once run it had left town abruptly after the cousins disappeared, selling the property for a fraction of its value. When agents tracked down surviving members, they found evasiveness and half-answers. Records revealed financial troubles, secret debts, and unexplained cash deposits in the months leading up to 1997. Was the lodge simply a front for something darker? Or had the owners been complicit in the disappearance? These questions hung heavy over the investigation. Then came the rumors of law enforcement involvement. Some townspeople claimed that back in 1997, local deputies discouraged certain leads, dismissing tips as irrelevant or not worth investigating. One retired officer allegedly warned a family not to dig too deep into what happened. While no concrete evidence of a cover-up surfaced, the FBI could not ignore the possibility that someone in power had deliberately kept the truth buried. If that were the case, then the cousin's disappearance wasn't just a crime. It was part of a conspiracy stretching far beyond the lodge walls. The whispers grew darker still when talk of secret tunnels beneath the lodge surfaced. Several locals swore that during construction in the 1950s, underground passages had been dug to store supplies or even to transport people unseen. Though no official blueprints mention them, old workers hinted at hidden routes that only a few ever knew about. If such tunnels did exist, they could explain how 5 cousins vanished without a trace, eluding even the massive searches that followed in 1997. The FBI began scanning the grounds with advanced radar, searching for voids in the earth. Each hollow detected only deepened the mystery. Complicating matters was the behavior of the townspeople themselves. Some cooperated willingly, while others grew defensive and hostile, as though afraid of what might surface if the FBI kept digging. Anonymous letters began arriving at the investigators' offices, warning them to stop the search, claiming that the past should stay buried. These notes, though unsigned, carried a threatening tone that suggested someone still had a vested interest in keeping the truth hidden even after 27 years. The FBI also noticed an odd trend in the town's history of silence. Every few years, when journalists or amateur sleuths tried to investigate, their efforts were mysteriously shut down. Old newspaper clippings revealed that stories about the lodge often disappeared from print or were edited to remove details. Local officials brushed it off as editorial changes, but agents began to suspect an organized effort to control the narrative. Whoever was behind it had influence, not just in 1997, but for decades afterward. As the conspiracy threads grew tangled, the families of the missing cousins felt both relief and dread. Relief because it finally seemed that answers might emerge. Dread because the truth appeared far more sinister than anything they had ever imagined. If the town itself had played a role, whether through complicity, silence, or active cover-up, then the disappearance was no longer just a mystery. It was a community secret, guarded fiercely by those who stood to lose everything if exposed. The FBI pressed forward, knowing that with each new lead, they were getting closer to the heart of a conspiracy that had been buried for nearly 3 decades. Yet the more they uncovered, the clearer it became that the lodge was not just a crime scene. It was the epicenter of something larger, something that reached into the very fabric of the town itself. And as the agents dug deeper, the whispers grew louder, almost as if the past was fighting to stay hidden.